The golden rays of the late afternoon sun filtered through the openings of the tree canopies and bathed the grass in pools of orange and amber. The trees cast tall shadows which stretched with each passing minute, and the forest seemed calming in its tranquility. Surrounded by the tangled embrace of foliage stood the church, tall and splendorous, despite nature trying to reclaim it. On the right of the church lay a large bronze bell on its side, next to a dilapidated belfry.
"There she is,"
said Garth under his breath as he gazed at the time-stained building.
"The graveyard should be right behind it."
They made their way onto an ancient cobblestone pathway, strewn with fallen leaves and fragments of a wayside shrine, and stood in front of the large wooden church doors.
"Coffee break inside?"
asked Tobias with a mischievous glint in his eyes.
"Seems a good place as any."
They pushed the doors, which opened with a loud creak. Inside the grandiose building, the stained glass windows projected a spectrum of vibrant hues through large beams that reached a colourful display on the decayed church benches. The two men stood for a moment to appreciate the almost magical and mystical display of mesmerizing rays of colour within the antique interior.
"Talk about coffee with a view."
Tobias withdrew a large flask from his backpack and poured steaming hot coffee into 2 cups. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the solemn ambience of the ancient church as the two sat on a cold stone step in front of the altar.
"Do you think it is in there?"
asked Garth, enjoying a sip of coffee.
"We will just have to see,"
answered Tobias.
"I think it will make a great addition to the museum. Visitors will be able to get to know her, and we will get to preserve her legacy."
Let's just hope vandals haven't plundered it yet.
Garth turned to Tobias with a smile of approval.
"You have really outdone yourself with this coffee."
Only the freshest beans.
Smiled Tobias proudly, adjusting his glasses. Outside the church, a gentle breeze sent dry leaves in a twirl that spiraled in the air and scattered amongst moss-covered tombstones. Tobias opened the rusty gate to the graveyard, and they made their way towards the far left on the opposite side of the church.
"These have been here for decades,"
said Garth, as he read some of the dates chiseled into the stone monuments. Some of the stones had crumbled and fallen apart over the years, and others were completely enshrouded in moss. Dried leaves and twigs cracked and crunched under the men's footsteps as they wove between the headstones.
"This must be it,"
said Tobias, as he took out his flashlight and shone it down the stone staircase of an old mausoleum. The entrance was framed by 2 large angel statues perched atop weathered stone pedestals and mounted to dark grey walls adorned with thick green vines.
"Look, they made statues of us,"
quipped Garth, imitating the angel's pose.
"I should hope not,"
rebuked Tobias solemnly, entering the mausoleum's shadowy interior.
"The one is missing its head."
Garth flicked his flashlight on and followed Tobias down the steps that led into a subterranean passage. They directed their lights across the dusty stone floor covered in leaves. Moss clung to the damp walls, and gnarled tree roots snaked into the passage through cracks and crevices in the ceiling and walls. Large cobwebs hung undisturbed, and a thick, earthy fragrance filled the air, mingled with the pungent aroma of decay. They passed several passages that led to adjacent chambers. Loose stones shifted beneath their steps, and various beetles and cockroaches scurried hastily from their lights. Disturbed moths fluttered erratically through the stagnant air, and spiders crawled up and down their silken webs, eager to ensnare a meal.
"How deep is her crypt?"
asked Garth, staring at a centipede that squirmed into a small crack.
"We should be close,"
assured Tobias. Garth couldn't help feeling the sensation of being watched. He directed his light down a crooked tunnel to his left, almost expecting something to stare back at him.
"Do you think,"
he started, his words trailing off,
"would it be okay to part the dead from their belongings?"
For a mere moment he hoped his words didn't fall onto the ears of the dead, as though verbalizing their intentions will somehow betray them, as though the dead themselves will judge their intentions unfavorably and seek retaliation.
Would you rather have your paintings rot away in some storage room where no one can see it?
Asked Tobias gently.
Or would it make your soul happy knowing they are displayed in an art gallery after you've died?
I guess you make a valid point. Though the only thing I've painted was the walls to the museum.
And you have been doing a marvelous job.
Chuckled Tobias.
In addition to that, we are potentially saving it from grave robbers who would either destroy it or sell it to some rich tycoon.
The passage wound to the left and descended down another staircase before veering sharply to the right and suddenly opening into a larger part.
This must be the antechamber,
said Tobias, inspecting the walls and ceiling with his flashlight.
Ah, here it is.
They entered a narrow doorway to the right that led into a large chamber. A faint beam of sunlight shone from a small opening in the ceiling and cast an earthly gloom on a large stone casket that was positioned in the very center of the chamber. A slab of marble concealed its occupant. Garth walked towards the casket and, with his flashlight clenched between his teeth, wiped the dirt and moss off a plaque with his sleeve. A sense of unsettling dread engulfed him as he realized that he stood before the final resting place of a once vibrant and jovial young woman.
This is her, all right.
He murmured, his voice tinged with a somber reverence.
That means her belongings should be...
He surveyed the chamber with his flashlight until his light landed upon a spacious niche in the wall.
Right there.
They walked across the chamber, crunching on dry leaves that entered through the small opening in the ceiling. Tobias grabbed a large tome from the stone surface and blew a thick layer of dust off the cover.
This is her personal writings,
he said, admiring the aged book.
Her accounts and memories, her recollections and intimate reminiscences.
Garth rolled his eyes.
You could have just said diary.
I prefer memoir,
replied Tobias with a dash of hauteur.
This calls for a toast.
Coffee?
Coffee.
They poured another cup of coffee. The aroma filled the chamber, and Garth, raising his nose to the ceiling, took a lengthy whiff of the fragrance.
This sure masks the damp smell we have had to deal with.
They emptied their cups and poured another. With the warm beverage in his left hand, Garth held the heavy book in his right, eager to learn more about its author. Just then, a loud scraping noise filled the room, as if stone sliding against stone. They swung around to discover the marble lid of the casket moving by itself before coming to a stop. With their hearts racing in their throats, they watched the open casket in silence. From within the casket, a figure sat upright. The muted gloom of the sunlight revealed a young woman clad in white. Her long hair seemed angelic in the light, and her pale skin almost ethereal. She turned her head to face the two men who stood motionless. Her face was difficult to see in the faint illumination. They stared at her for a moment before she crawled out of the casket. Her movements were fluid and almost poetic. Her bare feet made no noise on the leaves as she made slow, timid strides towards them. Her white dress swayed and billowed elegantly behind her. She stepped into the shadow, and they watched her silhouette approach them until it stood still. Tobias raised his flashlight to reveal a pair of milky white eyes like marbles, and long, pale fingers that reached out toward Garth. Garth extended the memoir towards her, only for her ethereal fingers to envelop his trembling cup. They watched as the ghostly being raised the cup to her mouth and consumed the contents before handing it back to a quivering Garth.
Most grateful, am I?
She said, in a soft and haunting voice that seemed to emanate from the chamber itself.
But 'tis been decades since I had good coffee.
She turned around and returned to her casket, where she lay down once more. The marble slab returned to its former resting place, concealing the casket. The two men stood aghast, transfixed by the strangeness of the situation. Their jaws hung open, and their eyes remained locked onto the casket.
What just happened?
Garth managed to choke out. Tobias carefully walked towards the casket. He placed his hand against the slab and pushed it with a heave. He gazed into the casket with his flashlight and stood perplexed. Garth walked over and stared over his shoulder. Inside the casket lay the skeletal remains of what once was a young woman, clad in a frazzled and stained white dress. Tobias and Garth sat in silence in front of the doorway to the church, breathing the fresh forest air. They tried to make sense of what they witnessed in the mausoleum.
Apparently, she was really enamored with coffee.
Tobias said as he flipped through her journal.
There's an entire chapter dedicated to it.
Garth fumbled his thumbs awkwardly and finally looked up.
Do we still have coffee left?
Tobias smiled at Garth.
I'll pour us some. If you enjoyed this short story, please like this video and subscribe to Undeadward for more.